I'm very pleased to introduce you today to Professor Kalwant Bhopal. Dr. Bhopal is Professor of Education and Social Justice, Professorial Research Fellow, and Deputy Director of the Center for Research in Race and Education in the School of Education at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Her research focuses on the achievements and experiences of minority ethnic groups in education. She has conducted research on exploring discourses of identity and intersectionality with a focus on the lives of Black minority ethnic groups and on the marginal position of gypsies and travelers. Specifically, her research examines how processes of racism, exclusion, and marginalization center or operate in predominantly white spaces with an emphasis on social justice and inclusion. More recently, Dr. Bhopal has conducted research focusing on the position of minority ethnic academics in higher education. This research has been used to inform policymaking in higher education, particularly the development of the Race Equality Charter mark. She has published 9 books, 10 edited book collections, and numerous journal articles. Her most recent book publications include Race and Education, Reproducing White Supremacy in Britain, that was published in 2024, and with Martin Myers, Elite Universities and the Making of Privileged, Exploring Race and Class in Global Educational Economies, published in 2023, and another book, Homeschooling and Home Education, Race, Class, and Inequality, published again in 2023. She's also published the book, Young People, Social Control and Inequality, Problems and Prospects from the Margins. Dr. Bhopal was recently conferred as Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences. She is visiting professor at Harvard University in the Harvard Graduate School of Education and visiting professor at King's College London in the Department of Education and Professional Studies. She has been visiting professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Queen's University, Belfast, and visiting scholar at the University College London Institute of Education. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kalwant Bhopal.
Good morning, everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share my work. So I just want to start off really with a little anecdote. Yesterday when we arrived in Canada, we were picked up by a taxi driver who was white and a Polish immigrant to Canada about 30 years ago. And interestingly, he immediately started to talk about immigration. And he said to us that he didn't think immigration was a very good idea because there were too many Indian people that were coming to Canada. Too many Indian, he kept saying Indian, clearly knew that I was from India. Too many Indian immigrants in Canada who were taking our jobs and our housing, etc., etc. But what was really interesting about him was that he too was an immigrant to Canada. But despite that, he was very anti-immigration. And it was really interesting because he was prepared to have a debate, although I was extremely tired and wasn't really interested in engaging at that time. I was more interested in going to sleep. But he was interested in hearing the other side. But what it made me realize is that we live in very troubled, fragile times at the moment, marred by risk, insecurity, and fragility, at least not of the global crisis in terms of the economic, social, and political climate that we currently live in, including war. So it is interesting that the discourses and narratives around racism is actually everywhere, including sitting in a taxi and going to the hotel. Okay, all good? Yeah. So what I want to do first of all is to start with policy making. And I'm actually obviously focusing on the UK, which is my area of expertise. So policy making paints a very positive picture around social justice and inclusion. So we've had the widening participation agenda, which was introduced by the new Labour government. The widening participation agenda is hugely important because it gave the opportunity for marginalised students to enter higher education. We've also had the Race Relations Act, which was introduced in the year 2000. The Race Relations Act is important because it gave us a definition of institutional racism. In 2010, we had the Equality Act, which brought together all previous legislation into one single act. The Equality Act is important because it includes protected characteristics, of which race is one. We've also had policy initiatives in higher education, including the Athena Swan Charter. The Athena Swan Charter works to progress the position of women in STEM subjects. And 10 years since its introduction, the Athena Swan Charter has shown to have a hugely significant impact on the position of women in senior roles in STEM. We've also had the Race Equality Charter mark, which works to progress the position of staff and students from racial minority backgrounds. And the Race Equality Charter is hugely important because it specifically focuses on race. However, in my work, I argue that historically, race has always been given a secondary status. Race always takes a backseat. It's gender that is always given primary status. The main beneficiaries of policy making in higher education, particularly the Athena Swan Charter, have been white women. The main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US have been white women. We've also had a significant increase in the numbers of black and minority ethnic students attending higher education institutions in the UK. I don't really like the term BME. There's other terms that we use in the UK, such as BAME, people of colour, ethnic minorities. But whichever term we use, it's important to understand that there are differences within and between those categories. So these categories are not homogeneous. So what I'm going to show you today is despite significant advances in policy making and indeed increases in the student body, inequalities in higher education for ethnic minority students continue to persist. So let's look at BME students and degree attainment. So white students are more likely to leave university with a first-class degree or a 2-1 compared to BME students as a whole. As I've said, there are differences within and between that category. Relatively higher proportions of Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage students are more likely to receive a first. But it's black students who continue to be the most disadvantaged, and indeed Pakistani and Bangladeshi students. There is a BME attainment gap or awarding gap of 10.7 percentage points, with the gap being the greatest for black students, but lower for Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage students. But what's really interesting about the statistics, in analysing the statistics, there has been small increases, but for the first time since COVID, actually, there has been a decrease. And Advanced HE state, this marks the first year since 2014-15 that the ethnicity degree awarding gap has in fact widened instead of narrowing, and indeed by a substantial amount compared with the smaller incremental decreases in the gap noted over the last decade. It's actually too early to tell why that is the case, but it is possible that it may be the impact of COVID, where the level of support that students received varied across different ethnic groups. So let's look at staff demographics in the UK. So of those with known ethnicity, around 12% of UK staff identified as being from a black and minority ethnic background. And there has been an increase in terms of the proportion of staff. It's almost doubled from 4.8% to 9.5% in 2021. Amongst UK academic staff, however, only 6.1% of staff are heads of institutions. So out of 154 higher education institutions in the UK, we only have 6 vice-chancellors or presidents who are from a BME background. Furthermore, a total of almost 90% of professors are white, compared to a variation in terms of the numbers, as you can see, from different BME groups. A larger proportion of white academic staff are more likely to be on the highest pay spine of $65,578 a year, or more compared to BME staff when they are doing the same job. So I thought it would be really interesting for you to see this table of the UK professoriate, particularly in relation to the numbers and how they are actually broken down. So you can see around 14,500 professors are white. If you look at the BME category as a whole, you have 1,680 professors from that category. If you break that category down, you can see that there are only 115 black professors, of which only 27 are women. So let's talk about white privilege. So in my work, I draw upon the work of Peggy McIntosh. And Peggy McIntosh argues that white privilege is an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions. It includes maps, sorry, I'm looking over there because I can't see the screen. It's a bit far away. Forgive me. Of passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. White privilege means you can walk through customs without being stopped. White privilege means you're less likely to be stopped and searched by the police. White privilege means you can use a restroom without being arrested. White privilege means you're more likely to leave the court a free man than if you are a black man. And Derek Bell argues, of course, racist hierarchical structures govern all political, economic, and social domains. He argues such structures allocate the privileging of whites in all arenas, including the so-called liberal field of education. And I argue in my work that there are different shades of whiteness. There's legitimate and illegitimate, acceptable and unacceptable forms of whiteness. So, for example, gypsy and traveller groups, who they themselves identify as white, do not have the same privileges afforded to white middle-class identities. So let's talk about intersectionality. It's really interesting. When I give these talks, I'm often accused of not understanding or writing about intersectionality. But if you know my work, you probably can see that I've written about intersectionality for many, many years. I would argue, however, that the concept of intersectionality more recently has actually become a bit of a bandwagonist buzzword, often used by white woke liberal feminists who claim to understand the impact of race on the experiences of women. And what's really interesting in relation to understanding how intersectionality works, it takes me back to understanding feminism. So traditionally, feminists were not concerned with the experiences of my mother or my grandmother. Historically, feminists were only concerned with the experiences of white women. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term, argues that, of course, a focus on the intersections of race and gender only highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. And from a critical race theory, a focus on the most privileged group members marginalise those who are multiply burdened and indeed obscures claims that cannot be understood in resulting from discrete sources of discrimination. And Anthea Uvale-Davis argues, of course intersectionality is an important term. It's the most comprehensive, it's the most complex and nuanced, and it does not reduce social hierarchical relations of power into one axle of power, whether it is class, race, or indeed gender. I argue, however, white privilege and indeed a hierarchy of oppression has resulted in a discourse of denial in which gender as a competing identity has always been given greater significance and prominence, compared to race. So an intersectional approach is indeed crucial to this discourse and narrative. So, in 2020, we had two significant events, two significant historical moments, I would argue, that changed the way we think about the world and indeed race. The first significant event was in March 2020, when the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a world pandemic. And the second significant historical moment or event was the murder of George Floyd on May the 25th, 2020. This sparked global national Black Lives Matter protests on May the 26th, firstly in the US and then worldwide. It was estimated that 15 to 26 people in the US participated in these demonstrations, and it is indeed considered the largest movement in the country's history. There were 260 protests in the UK, in different towns and cities, and hundreds in Europe, and indeed worldwide. So this historical moment was a moment when we were forced to address issues of racial injustice globally. What impact did they have? So, certainly in the UK, we had a backlash immediately after the Black Lives Matter movement. So, historically, we were at a moment when racial injustice was meant to be addressed. But very quickly, we had the backlash where white lives mattered even more. And in the UK, this resulted in hashtags, including hashtag White Lives Matter, hashtag All Lives Matter. But what was really interesting in the UK, and I don't know what the situation was in Canada, and it would be good to hear, was the backlash very quickly shifted from the social climate to a political and policy climate. And I'm going to show you how this happened. So those of us that were fighting for and continue to fight for racial justice were actually accused of being, what was it? Guardian reading, tofu eating, wokerati. That's what we were accused of. And as lockdown busting, statue toppling anarchists who wanted to fight against understanding the impact of particularly slavery in the UK. And Malik said that this was an impact which diminished the moral power of demands for racial equality and social justice, so that they are then easier to extinguish, and to depict them as a militant threat to life as we know it, rather than a belated and in fact extremely fragile, and I would argue that this was the case, attempt to secure basic rights to life, representation, and dignity. And at the time, the shift from the social discourse and narrative of racial injustice very quickly moved into the House of Commons. And the House of Commons set up what they called a common sense group. And they argued, we are ready for a culture war, and we are confident that our policy agenda will win it. So very quickly, policy was implemented to fight against the impact of Black Lives Matter. And this group accused the National Trust of being coloured by cultural Marxist dogma and in the grip of elite bourgeois liberals, which led to the inquiry into the evidence of the links between the National Trust properties and indeed the slave trade. And it was found that there was extreme evidence to show this. So yeah, white lives mattered more, but they mattered even more in terms of understanding that discourse and narrative. And Oliver Dowden, who was then Secretary of State for Culture, said that museums would no longer receive funding if they took down statues. Furthermore, the teaching about white privilege and indeed critical race theory was seen to be breaking the law, as was decolonizing the curriculum. And schools in England were told by the Department of Education that they were no longer allowed to teach using materials that were produced by anti-racist groups. And then Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, and I quote, "We are proud of this country's culture, its history and its traditions." He suggested that the Labour Party supported those who wanted to pull down statues, rewrite the history of our country, to edit our national CVs to make it look more politically correct. So you can see how the shift from the social climate very quickly moved into the political and policy climate in the House of Commons. And another example of this is what Kemi Badenoch, who was then Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, and as a footnote, I should add that Kemi Badenoch is a black woman. And she said, "I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close in my life, which is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology which sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. We should not apologise for the fact that British children primarily study the history of these islands." And she said, "It goes without saying that the recent fad to decolonise maths, decolonise engineering, decolonise the sciences that we've seen across our universities, to make race the defining principle of what is studied, is not just misguided, but actively opposed to the fundamental purpose of education." So to make race the defining principle of what is studied is not just misguided, but actively opposed to the fundamental purpose of education. And I think that that's the most important part of that quote, because clearly she has actually completely ignored the impact of Black Lives Matter. Okay, those were supposed to flow in, but I think that's probably not going to happen. So these are just examples of okay, sorry about that. They were meant to come in one by one. Technology never works when you want it to. So these are just the tip of the iceberg and are examples of racism post Black Lives Matter in higher education. Oh, we're still going on. Sorry. There we go. You got the gist of that, though, right? So, as a critical race theorist, I draw on the work of critical race theory to understand how racism works. And racism in education is actually business as usual. And Delgado and Stefanik argue that racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's normal science. It's the usual way that society does business. It's the common, everyday experiences of most people of colour in this country, the US, and indeed, I would argue, the world. So the recent data tells us that nearly a third of people from ethnic minority and religious minority groups have reported racial discrimination in education. And there's evidence to suggest that universities themselves perpetuate institutional racism. Individuals experience racism from their peers, from their lecturers. This is through racial profiling and racial othering, and indeed through an ethnocentric curriculum that perpetuates imperialism and colonialism. Furthermore, ethnic minority students are more likely to drop out of university. They're more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups. This is no accident. This is racism, which is the normal way that society does business. Okay, so it isn't just education where we see how racism exists as business as usual. There's evidence to suggest, and these are all recent reports post-Black Lives Matter, that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist. There's racism in sport, in football and cricket, which a recent report found widespread and deep-rooted examples of racism. There's racism in politics. The majority of black and ethnic minorities experience racism on a daily basis, particularly high for women, such as Diane Abbott, Sadiq Khan, and Zara Sultana. Racism exists in the media. There are stereotypical portrayals of ethnic minorities, of migrants and refugees, who are always portrayed as being associated with dirt. There's racism in the labour market. Ethnic minorities are more likely to experience racism on a daily basis. There's there's racial discrimination in housing. Ethnic minorities have the worst housing experience of all groups. They're more likely to live in housing that is not heated and has damp conditions, etc. There's racism in health. Ethnic minorities have the worst health outcomes and indeed the worst mental health of all ethnic groups. Furthermore, black and minority ethnic women are more likely to die during childbirth. Furthermore, the pandemic highlighted already existing racial inequalities. For example, ethnic minorities were the most disadvantaged. They were less likely to isolate, they were more likely to die from the pandemic, and they were more likely to live in poverty as a result of the pandemic. So this is racism that is the everyday way in which society works, not just in education, but in other areas of society. So the backlash was already going on in the US, so it wasn't just in the UK. Across the pond, then President Donald Trump, who actually may be president again this year, he issued an executive order, and he said, federal agencies must cease and desist from using taxpayers' dollars to fund divisive, un-American training sessions. Specifically, he said, any training on critical race theory and white privilege, or any other training or propaganda efforts that teaches or suggests either that the US is an inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. And Victor Ray argued, the administration's shallow understanding conflates and maligns these ideas without really considering their potential ability for solving entrenched social problems. For an administration whose support is grounded in white grievance, distinctions between ideas are apparently immaterial. And any research showing the depth and continuity of white anger is seen as a threat. And currently, critical race theory and the teaching of white privilege has already been banned in 32 US states, and 22 are currently considering banning it. So I want to just focus very briefly on a report that was published after Black Lives Matter. The Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparities was introduced by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson to examine how racial injustice could be tackled in the UK. And what was really interesting about this report is that this report found no evidence of institutional racism. I quote, put simply, we no longer see Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. The impediments and disparities do exist, but they are varied, and ironically, very few of them are directly to do with racism. Too often, racism is the catch-all explanation and can be simply implicitly accepted rather than explicitly examined. So what was really interesting about this was, again, it's an example of the backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement to simply dismiss examples of racial injustice and indeed racial cruelty, some of which I've already outlined. This report, in fact, uses a deficit model. It blames families for their lack of education. Indeed, it conflates race and class together without actually looking at the impact that this has. And the report itself focuses on fairness rather than looking at inequality. So the report itself was actually, I would argue, a threat to identities of whiteness and discourses of whiteness, and indeed British identity in terms of what that means. There was a failure to confront decades of racism, particularly the brutal violence of colonialism and imperialism on black and brown communities. And it reminds me of Derek Bell, who argues that who delivers the message is as important as the message itself. And this is what he calls the rules of racial standing. And the author of the Commission of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities, Tony Sewell himself, is a black man. And he argued, as I've just quoted, that there was no evidence of actually racism. And Derek Bell states, "The usual exception is the black person who publicly disparages or criticizes other blacks who are speaking or acting in ways that upset whites. Instantly," he argues, "such statements are granted enhanced standing, even when the speaker has no special expertise or indeed experience in the subject that he or she is criticizing." So in effect, the Conservative government, with their black and brown members of cabinet who say that there is no such thing as racial injustice, are in fact mouthpieces for the government to justify white supremacy and indeed to justify white privilege. These individuals themselves are able to perform whiteness, and consequently, who delivers the message is just as important as what the message itself is saying. So it legitimizes racism when a black or brown person says there's no such thing as racism. So who benefits from what I call white policy making? So again, Derek Bell, he argues, yes, of course, whites will advance the causes of racial justice only when doing coincides with their own self-interest. So of course universities will invest in race equality, the Race Equality Charter, or indeed EDI policies, but only when it benefits them more than the groups to which it is aimed. David Gilbourne argues, the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system. A tacit intentionality in the system. So it's no accident that black or brown students are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. It's no accident that black or brown students are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups. It's no accident that black students and black and brown students are more likely to leave university, drop out of university, citing racism from their peers and their lecturers. All this is a tacit intentionality in the system. It's not accidental. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. Just as white women are the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter, white women are the main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US. And I argue that the performativity and enactment of policy making, such as the Race Equality Charter and the EDI, it becomes a ritual. It's a dance, a toing and a froing, without really addressing racial inequalities in any concrete way. I argue that this deliberate ritual works for the benefit of higher education institutions, which simply reinforces normative practices and ideologies which work to uphold a system of white supremacy that primarily and only benefits white groups. So what I want to do now, so what I hope I've done is, first of all, to give you some quantitative statistical evidence, then a little bit of my thinking around my scholarship and theory. And now I'm going to give you an example of a research project that backs up and highlights everything that I've just said. So I carried out a piece of research examining the everyday experiences of racism in higher education. And the importance of this research is that it was post-BLM. 43 interviews were conducted with ethnic minority students who were in different higher education institutions. They all self-identified as Black British, British Indian, etc. They were all born in the UK, and they were all in the final year of their undergraduate study. And as I said, the importance of this is that it was post-BLM. So one of the things that the respondents talked about again and again and again and again was the racism that they experienced despite the impact of the Black Lives Matter moment. And this is something that I call everyday polite racisms. So there was an awareness of this important historical moment where we felt that there was going to be change. But that awareness actually shifted in terms of the way racism was experienced and understood. So Jonathan said, "It's here, yes, racism is everywhere. It's because the public narrative gives it credence and it allows it to happen. So people think it's okay to be racist. These days, it's more acceptable to be racist. I think the way that things have progressed, or indeed not progressed, around race has made it okay to say racist things and for people to see that as a legitimate view." And Amrit said, "I feel the universities have to be shown to be doing something, but a lot of that is in fact a show. Otherwise, they'll be accused of being racist. They pretend to do things to make a difference, but they don't make any real changes. So, all the professors here are white. So what's changed? Nothing at all." So what was really interesting about the everyday polite racisms is that many of the students, when the murder of George Floyd happened, were quite happy to put hashtag BLM on their Snapchat stories and their Instagram. So they publicly supported anti-racism. But when they were with their peers, they were quite happy to use racial slurs and say that it was banter, it's a joke. So there was this public acceptance of racial injustice, but privately there was the fact that it was not accepted. So that they used hashtag BLM on their Snapchat stories, but then they thought it was okay to use racial slurs. And when students of colour did complain, it's banter, you're being overly sensitive, it's just a joke. So what was really interesting there was how the public and private understandings and support or non-support for racism worked. So consequently, students used coping mechanisms and support to get them through this. And Farah said, "There's a sort of seating plan in all the seminars and indeed the lectures. It's not a formal seating plan, it's the one the students have introduced, and it's kind of stuck. So yeah, you could say that I sit with the other Asian girls, but because it makes me feel more comfortable, because I know I won't be judged and I will be accepted." So there was this notion, so despite the public discourse and indeed the ways in which universities responded to Black Lives Matter, so for example, and I've done some analysis of this and it's in the book, many universities on their Twitter pages said that we do not tolerate racism in our universities, we will fight for racial justice. These were the same universities that had the biggest attainment gap. These were the same universities that didn't have one black professor in some of their faculties. So this was the performative element of Black Lives Matter. And Troy said that, "I was very annoyed," this is an example of the racism he experienced, "I was very annoyed when the woman at the careers service said that she wasn't sure if I should do a master's law conversion course. She doesn't know anything about me. All she sees is a black male, and she uses that to make stereotypes about what I should and what I shouldn't be doing. That's the subtleties of racism that can knock your confidence. You could say it's actually a microaggression, so that I don't get a little bit above myself, if you like. So he always needed to be put in his place. One of the interesting things about the students was that they knew, because they were in their final year of their undergraduate study, and there's lots of research to say that to show that the decisions that students make in the final year of undergraduate study has a huge impact on social mobility, access to the labour market, and indeed future life chances. So whilst these students were going to do pretty well in their degrees, they also felt as though they would continue to experience racism. So, you know, there's no such thing as a meritocracy. And Valerie said it's very easy for employers to be racist because they can do it in an underhand kind of way. It can be disguised. They can say, well, you don't have enough experience or you won't fit in with us. These are all ways to say, well, we don't want you because you are not white. Your face does not fit. I think having a name like Parminder doesn't really help me, does it? I think they'll take one look at my application and say, do we really want an Asian girl working here? Even though I could have a first-class degree, they'd rather take the white person. Firstly, you look different because you're not white. And secondly, your name is far too difficult for them to say or indeed to spell. So why would they even bother? So, ethnic minority students post-Black Lives Matter, and indeed pre-Black Lives Matter, continue to occupy a marginal status within higher education. They are outsiders within, because higher education is a white space reserved for whites only. Gilborn argues that conventional forms of anti-racism have proven unable to keep pace with the development of increasingly racist and exclusionary education policies. These operate beneath a veneer of professed tolerance and diversity. So it's performative, it's a pretense. And I argue, normative hegemonic practices, of course, exist in higher education, which follow ethnic minority students into the labour market and indeed wider society. And I've shown you the evidence of racism in all areas of society. Ethnic minority students continue to be disadvantaged in higher education because they do not fit in with normative white ways of being and doing. And indeed, CRT reminds us that advances in racial equality produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. This is a hard to accept fact that all of history verifies, and indeed, Black Lives Matter is one example of that. The interests of blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when that interest converges with the interests of whites in policy-making positions. And as I've already said, yes, of course, universities are going to invest in EDI policy-making, but only if it benefits the white groups more. And I argue higher education in the UK, and indeed I would say globally, is now a market in which race is increasingly treated as a commodity. It becomes ever more entwined within metrics that benefit university status rather than addressing racism on an individual or indeed a collective basis. The neoliberal marketized climate that we live in makes higher education a capitalist commodity within which race itself has become a commodity, more so after Black Lives Matter. So, post-Black Lives Matter, I would argue, race is only addressed during particular historical moments, such as the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence in the UK, the tragic murder of George Floyd. Race is silenced, and it's re-silenced. Race is weaponized. How do you know it's racism, I'm often asked? Where are you from? Where are you really from? Race is secondary. What about us? We're women. What about us? We're working class. Race is a commodity. EDI programs are bought and sold within a marketized economy. Race is declassed. Black or brown working class communities simply don't exist. It's the white working class that are the most oppressed. Race has been dealt with. We now live in a post-racial society. These changes are tokenistic, they're tick box, they're performative, and they work for the benefit of the organizations. So racism, institutional, structural, and let's not forget individual racism, the racism that we experience down the corridors from our peers and indeed our students. It's deliberately allowed to flourish, deliberately allowed to perpetuate a system that benefits whites to uphold white supremacy. So where are we today? Are these new racisms, or are they just old racisms? 24 years ago, Bonilla, Silva and Foreman argued, 24 years ago, so the dates on these quotes are really important. A new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy. It allows whites to appear not racist, to preserve their privileged status, to blame blacks for their lower status, and criticize any institutional approach, such as affirmative action, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. And 13 years ago, we argued, just after the Macpherson report was published, which was a result of the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered because he was black, we said, to argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society is utterly absurd. Such discourses, we argued, served only to further disadvantage and marginalize black and minority ethnic communities. Racism exists at every level of society. It permeates our schools, our colleges, and indeed our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media, and the social spaces that we occupy. And I argue in 2024, the focus on addressing diversity signifies a retreat from any meaningful engagement with issues of race and racism. In effect, I argue, diversity is recognized, but oppression is ignored. Talk of inclusion, I argue, becomes a rhetorical victory for universities, with bold assertions about the creation of inclusive spaces. I put it to you that these are not new racisms in 2024. These are just old racisms. This is racism, which is business as usual. Thank you. Available in all good bookshops.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You can hear me? Okay. I have a very similar background in education and social justice. Now, in my own research project and agenda over the past few decades, I suppose I'm influenced by being someone who's interested in curriculum, having been a teacher for many years before becoming an academic. In my reports, and I've looked at minority children, in particular minority boys of Arab and Black background in inner city settings, but I always come up in a pragmatic way with options, positivity, things that school boards, schools, teachers, communities are doing to counteract what is certainly discernible racism. So I get what you're saying, the overall arching theme of widespread insidious racism, and I keep thinking, what now? What are more tangible things that you recommend that we do in our institutions, including at the secondary level, to create safer and truly more inclusive cites not just lip service for inclusivity?
Thank you. That's a really good question. It's a really important question as well.
Thank you.
So I think there's lots of things that we can do in terms of understanding how we fight racial injustice. So the first thing I think we should all think about is, I don't like to use this term because, you know, what does it even mean? Decolonising the curriculum, in inverted commas. So this is something that's really big in the UK, from primary to secondary to higher education. And we have to think about what we are teaching our children. We have to think about the histories that we are teaching them so that black and brown groups are portrayed and given, well, truer histories in terms of their contribution, particularly in the UK, to World War II, and how imperialism and colonialism wasn't always positive, and also in relation to violence against these groups. That's the first thing we can do. Secondly, I think we have to listen to our students in terms of what they're telling us. We have to create safe spaces so that students can talk about racism. In the UK, this is very difficult. So in my research, I found that when students did complain about racism, this was simply dismissed as bad behaviour. It was dismissed as teenagers being teenagers. So racism, complaints about racism were not taken at face value. And I think that's really, really important. And I think as teachers, we have to understand that when students, or indeed our peers, other teachers or academics complain about racism, we have to have a complaints process that's fit for purpose. Many universities and schools do not have that. And finally, I would say a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. So having that conversation is really important, and having difficult conversations about white privilege as well are also important.
Good morning. Thank you for a very great and insightful presentation. I have a question about, as a critical race theorist, what are your opinions about the term minority ethnic, or ethnic minority, or black minority ethnic groups? And I ask this because, to me, using the term minority in relation to racialized groups of people implies superiority, inferiority against black and brown people. And I would further state that I think I think black and brown people have been minoritized rather than being considered a minority. So to achieve racial social justice, we must also decolonize language, I believe. So I was really just curious about what trends or insights you can share about how social justice educators in the UK are pushing against language that continue to prejudice black and brown folks.
That's an excellent question, really, really excellent question, and very, very important. So I said very briefly at the beginning of my talk that, so in the UK, the terminology is BME and BAME, and I don't like any of those terms because of what you've just said, because of the term minority is actually, it's the discourse around that language where groups have been made to be minorities. So I myself, as an academic, am moving away from using those terms. And this is based on my research that I've carried out with these groups. And the term that I personally am now using is people of colour, or black or brown groups, rather than black minority ethnic or ethnic minority groups. And I think that the reason I think those terms are important, because my respondents from those groups say that's how they want to be identified. That's how they want their voices to be heard. And I think whichever terminology we use, we must define it and must say, as I said at the beginning, that these terms are not homogenous. There's differences within and between the brown category, for instance, the Asian category. So there's lots of evidence to show that Indian groups perform better than Pakistani or Bangladeshi groups through all stages of education in the UK. Okay, so I think we have to, as a critical race theorist, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that the terms are problematic. So I personally am moving towards people of colour or black or brown groups. I mean, what term would you use? Do you have a preference yourself? I'm not supposed to ask questions, am I? But I'm going to ask you anyway. Yeah. Exactly, and that's great, yeah. And I think that's probably better than people of colour because it actually recognises that oppression. And I'm going to write that down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to your very insightful questions and comments, and thank you, Professor Bhopal, for your excellent talk.
Thank you very much.